Welcome back to Midco Sports Magazine. I am Jay Elsen. The history of auto racing in the Sioux Falls area is both rich and rocky, with success and turmoil often running side by side. That is certainly evident within the story of Soo Speedway, which experienced a rise and fall that helped shape the sport for generations.
As time pushes forward in southeast South Dakota, so too does the inevitability of change. The hustle and bustle of Sioux Falls is extending its reach in every direction, making land like this harder and harder to find.
If I haven't found 100,000 golf balls, I haven't found nothing.
This particular plot on the city's extreme eastern edge has been in Robert Van Beek Jr.'s family for nearly 60 years.
I've seen that one before.
But each one of these little white balls is a reminder that those days, along with the notion of being in the country, are numbered.
The city wants us to come in, which eventually it will. Somebody will buy it and they'll have their way.
The sad part is, when that day finally comes, it will further camouflage a story that's already been covered up by decades of inactivity.
Well, where that black dirt is up there, there was a cement pad we tore out. Yeah, it was right. It'd be right up out in here, right up in here. When you walked from this, that was a gate right there.
Believe it or not, there was a time when this place was an entertainment destination and where the city of Sioux Falls got its first taste of stock car racing.
They say it was a fast track, really fast track.
Stock car racing was born in the southeastern United States near the end of World War II and slowly made its way north. The Lyon County Fairgrounds in Rock Rapids, Iowa was one of the first facilities in the Northern Plains to host the sport on a regular basis. It was there that a man named Bob VanAn cut his teeth as a track promoter. Unfortunately, according to his son Tom, it's also where VanAn would get his first experience with the confrontational part of the business.
Got into it with the fair board down there and decided, well, instead of just renting their track, we'll build one up in Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls is a growing community, and that's what happened.
And we have as our guest Mr. Bob on our immediate right here, and Francis VanAn on the outside there, who have Soo Speedways just outside of Sioux Falls. Is that right, Bob?
That's right, Jim.
It was my father and his brother and 3 other guys from Rock Rapids.
Tom Savage was 15 years old and already a race car enthusiast when his family moved to Sioux Falls from the Indianapolis area in 1954. That happened to be the same year that Soo Speedway opened.
It was a 38-mile racetrack. It had a seating capacity of 2,500 people, which was kind of unheard of for a little dirt racetrack back in the day. It had a lighting system. The entire track was well lit. It was really the latest up-to-date racetrack in the area. I used to like to go in there with my camera and my notebook, and I thought of a lot of creative ways to sneak into the pit area. But the guy who ran the racetrack, Bob VanAn, he thought of every creative way to catch me and escort me into the grandstand.
VanAn put a lot of people in that grandstand. He also displayed a knack for attracting talent to the pits.
He was involved in the automotive business, so he knew automobiles, and he was a pretty square guy, you know. He had a lot of foresight. He knew what was coming down the pike.
Savage recalls one particular decision that helped take Soo Speedway to another level. When the track first opened, modified stock cars were all the rage. They were also expensive, so when numbers started to decline around 1956, VanAn added a strictly stock class.
It was a great idea because it introduced a lot of new people into the sport, and by the end of the 57 season, there were as many strictly stock cars as there were modified cars.
VanAn's vision helped push the average car count as high as 60 to 80 per week. Drivers flocked to Sioux Falls from all over the area, places like Aberdeen, Chamberlain, Sioux City, and beyond. Soo Speedway was thriving, both on the track and at the gate.
The place was packed. Every Sunday night it was packed. I mean, when they had all the seats taken, people were standing up and watching it.
Meanwhile, about 10 miles to the northeast, another racetrack was struggling to find any success at all. Like VanAn's group, Till Hewson opened his facility near Brandon, South Dakota in the spring of 1954.
He had a 3/8-mile oval carved out there with nothing else. There was no guardrail, no lights, no bleachers. There was nothing there. And because there was no lights, he couldn't race at night. He had to race in the afternoon. And racing on the afternoon on a dirt racetrack is very, very difficult because it gets so dusty. So he was behind the 8 ball from the beginning.
Hewson made every effort to catch up with his competition. He tried adding lights, moving the races to different nights, even resizing the track. None of it worked. So at the end of the 1955 season, Soo Speedway went dormant, leaving Soo Speedway to rule the local racing scene alone. Success can be a tricky thing. In the case of Soo Speedway, good racing and great crowds had gone hand in hand from the beginning. But by the summer of 1957, the drivers were starting to feel like their role in that was being undervalued. At the time, they were racing for 40% of the gate, which worked out to anywhere from $600 to $900 depending on crowd size. On the night of the season championship, a group of them approached VanAn and threatened to boycott the race without a guaranteed purse of $1,000. VanAn reluctantly agreed, and the show went on as scheduled. Unfortunately, the friction didn't exactly dissipate. The normal 40% purse was re-established for the start of the following season. That only furthered the frustrations for modified drivers, who were now forced to split that money with the strictly stock class. So in July of 1958, they decided to try and force VanAn's hand again. Only this time, he didn't flinch.
All the modified cars, as they came down what is now a 6-mile road, but that was a gravel road back in those days, they just lined up out there on the road, and they wouldn't come into the pit area.
They were demanding more money for the purse, and from what I understand, my father and his group of guys says, "Goodbye, go. We'll just shut her down."
So they all turned around and went back home, and there was no races that night.
The very next night, a group of those racers congregated in a YMCA meeting room in downtown Sioux Falls. It was there that they formed the Sioux Falls Stock Car Association and elected car owner Fred Buckmiller as president. Members then purchased shares of stock in the group and used that money, approximately $14,000, to purchase Till Hewson's racetrack.
When they bought that place, calling it rundown was being nice. It had sat idle all that time, and their weeds were growing 3 and 4 foot high. And besides that, Till took a lot of his old tractors and trucks and things and put them down there. It looked like a junkyard. You couldn't even tell that there was a racetrack down there.
It didn't stay that way for long. Just 2 weeks after leaving Soo Speedway in the rearview mirror, Buckmiller's group held its first race at Soo Speedway. And with that, the landscape of racing in South Dakota had officially taken a left turn.
The roles were completely reversed. Now it was Soo Speedway where everybody was going.
To a young Tom VanAn, the success of Soo Speedway was a bitter pill to swallow, especially following the death of his father in 1962, when he was just 11 years old.
I grew up thinking that Soo Speedway closed my father's track. I mean, ran it out of business or for whatever reason, not knowing the story, not knowing what happened.
VanAn's stance softened by the time he turned 18. That's when his needs had started to outweigh that lack of interest, and it led him to the very threshold he never thought he'd cross.
There wasn't any summer jobs for an 18-year-old kid in Sioux Falls, so I went out to the track to see Joe Kusler, who was a concessionaire for my father, and I, looking for at least a little bit of work. Joe says, "You're not working for me. You're not hawking popping popcorn. You're too good for that. Go down and see Buck."
Buck was, of course, Fred Buckmiller, the same man who'd played such an instrumental role in the demise of Soo Speedway.
And I says, "Who's Buck?" And he says, "He runs the place." So I went down, he was pulling away from the pump. I jumped up with the running board on the passenger side, stuck my head in. I says, "Buck, my name's Tom VanAn. Looking for some work." And like he saw a ghost.
That reaction likely had everything to do with VanAn's late father. In retrospect, Buckmiller, who by that time had gained his own first-hand experience in running a racetrack, may have been having some regrets.
Years later, Fred Buckmiller says, "What we did to Bob VanAn and Soo Speedway was terrible. We should never have done that." The fact of the matter was, there were nights when 40% of the gate was over $1,000. So Buckmiller himself admitted that boycotting and doing that was a bad thing. They should never have done that.
If anybody knows who Fred Buckmiller was, he's a pretty gruff man. he could be on the exterior. Hard as gold. I mean, it was great. We rode around the truck with him for a couple hours. He was asking me about my mother and how I've been doing and all kinds of stories and stuff. And he says, "You're looking for work? Be here tomorrow morning." You know, and that was a Sunday. So that's how I started out there.
VanAn initially handled odd jobs around the track, but he quickly climbed the ladder. Within a few years, he became a full-time member of the officiating crew and eventually took over as the director of the Hewson's racing program. In that role, drawing off the teachings of Buck Miller, VanAn developed a reputation for running things fast and fair. That earned him the respect of competitors and co-workers alike, and ultimately led him to be enshrined in the Hewson's Hall of Fame in 2011.
I am proud of the fact that that was my father's track, and I am proud of the fact that I did go to Hewson's and had a pretty good career there, and I really enjoyed it and met a lot of neat people.
Since Bob VanAn first helped bring stock car racing to the Sioux Falls area, the sport has always managed to find a way. It's weathered the storm of conflict at every turn, which is something it's still doing today. But as the memories of Soo Speedway continue to be swallowed by time, those that experienced its short-term greatness can't help but wonder what might have been.
I wish that they could have got together and solved their differences, because that was a popular place.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another new episode of Midco Sports Magazine.
This has been Midco Sports Magazine, presented by Sanford Orthopedics and Sports Medicine.